So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the King Majora Show chill stream on X. All right, this is the take two. So, we're going to start with this chill stream and speaking about ESP first. I'm just going to cover some things that I've been talking about lately in my content creation and advocating for on X, the legitimacy of the ESP and PK research by the United States government and so many others. And this is the I guess this is where you typically would look to begin your studies into the research of ESP and the United States federal government. Project scanning, you know, here's one bit of evidence, and there's a phenomenal book before I get into it. There's a phenomenal book right here. And speaking of phenomena by Annie Jacobson or Jacobson. I don't know how you would actually pronounce that, so I apologize if you watch. You people should really go ahead and pick up this book, and I cannot stress enough the urgency to read books. They are still highly valuable. They pack a lot more information and things you can call forth to basically, to I guess you could say it refines your knowledge more than typically what you would get with a catered content creator in today's age, YouTube or Rumble video, or something that's made to mass produce for virality and meme magic with like X. It's just something that it's an experience that loads you with information, and this book is just it was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. You would be surprised just how seriously our institutions, from academia to the government, took extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, and parapsychology in the early days of the 1900s, and even before with Aether and whimsy therein. You know, this book gives you credible sources. I mean, like I said, this isn't a nobody. She's made several books. She's a highly credible author that has documented these cases of psychic research within the United States government, and it's something you can't pass up on. So there's that, and we might read a little bit of it. But Project Scanate, this was actual CIA. You see this? CIA. Project Scanate, scanned by coordinate, was a secret 1970s CIA funded program developed at the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, to investigate remote viewing. It researched whether individuals could use psychic phenomena and clairvoyance to gather intelligence on distant Soviet targets. And so that was the application that it was justified to be studied for the the CIA to basically grant money from the taxpayers to investigate psychic phenomena. And it begins as you know so shit. This book tells you the Russians, the Soviet Union, right? The former Soviet Union was developing a secularized to a radical extent view of the occult sciences and psychic abilities. There were so many people they were finding that had these extraordinary abilities, and they wanted to use it in basically warfare during this this time period of Cold War antics and so forth. And what perfect way to spy and espionage than with these mind eye tactics. And it boiled down to it could actually be repeatable. The only reason they did not continue after over I believe it was like 2 decades of research, if I'm not mistaken, publicly stated research, not to mention black projects, in dealing with the First Earth Battalion. Okay, this isn't just a fringe idea. I know you have a lot of uh, skeptics have done such a terrible job at being actual skeptics, and that's by design. You might have seen, if you're watching this stream or if you see the thumbnail, Rockefeller is on the thumbnail. Well, because Rockefeller and his foundation, right? And I'm going to get into the First Earth Battalion, but Rockefeller had established a bureaucracy within academia by his own philanthropy into things such as the publications of books itself and literature that went into schools, school unions, and advocating for policy in schools. For this branch of bureaucracy that prioritizes not thinkers, but workers. It frowned upon intellectualism and outsider explorations with creativity and wanted the masses to be on to a strictly excuse me, industrialized, Rockefeller endorsed academic, you just don't think too hard, work and enjoy your vices and pay taxes. That was the infrastructure of Rockefeller that followed the doctrines of the Federal Reserve and the Jacobins and the Rothschilds. They're all kind of connected together. I mean, Rothschild, the banking tycoon cartel business of the fractionalized banking and having nations in debt to him. They formed this coalition, and this is where it connects back to what I'm speaking about currently, of the perceptions of having supernatural perceived supernatural abilities is relegated to fantasy and schizophrenia and other mental health illnesses when there is heavily documented cases of such phenomena. And speaking of mental health, before we get into this again, I promise you this stream we will get into that. This medical industry, the foundations of mental health today are mainly dictated off the bedrock foundations of the mental hygiene movement, which was started by people that branched out eventually into the Third Reich with the Thule Society and the Adolf Hitler administration. And we can get into, speaking about the Adolf Hitler administration, I just want to show this. This book is damning in itself. It just shows documentation of, Zionist collaborations with the Nazis showing before, after, and during the alleged Shoah, and I do say alleged burnt offering. I've read the Talmud Torah enough to know that it's supposed to be a burnt offering for, messianic figures, and we can even debate if it even happened. But we're not doing the Duganist trap of just worshiping the Reich when we go about our eugenics discussions, because, this ties back to what I'm speaking about. Euthenics and the modern movements. So I want to bring up a book because it's pivotal to what we're speaking about, that goes right back into this discussion about ESP. I promise you it'll make sense. So this book by Jim Marrs, and Jim Marrs, bless his soul, rest in peace. He is dead now, but this man revolutionized my thinking. Okay, he didn't go necessarily too hard on the JQ aspects because realistically, look at who would be publishing him. But he did a damn good job as an investigative journalist in several other places. But not, he did go into that, but his angle was slightly soft on that aspect, which is understandable. But he talks about the Rockefellers, the mental cleanliness movement, the mental hygiene movement, and how basically, okay, so being French was enough to be considered mentally ill to these people. Being promiscuous woman was enough to be considered mentally ill. Okay. This makes sense to what we're talking about because it establishes the narrative of skeptics, academia, and propaganda. Okay, I'm not really good with how to function with this shit, so my apologies. Apparently it's only in these, it's not in the correct sections for me to understand it. Oh wait, there we go. Okay, so here we go, and he talks about psychiatry and eugenics. Let me see if I can find, he talks about their book, and he brings up people that are not considered mainstream thought, bringing up like Wundt, these lesser known figures from our past develop, like, psychiatrists, the men behind Hitler, referencing books of ideology and research over the years. Like I said, it's a tragedy that he's dead because I'd love to read another book by this man. But And you should really consider reading it or finding an avenue to purchase or view it. This is priceless information. Well, basically, it tells the story of the early pharmaceutical proto-Nazi mindset of what became mental cleanliness and hygiene that eventually developed into the fifth column of uh, I guess as a form of control over what people believe and perceptions of what is possible and is dictated as structured how society should function as the defined norm for the psychology movement of mental health that we have today. And what do we, when we listen to these people and define them as credible, going back to the anti-Verecundian principle that I always go by, this idea of infallibility within these institutions of academia is complete and utter nonsense and is actually against Occam's razor when it comes to the notions of how humans function and how they realistically would in any sort of situation. Relying on the factors of genetics, bloodline, how you treat family, how you institutionalize and go forward within allegiances within your own dynamics with blood feuds therein and the self-defined mythologies of your lineage, the coat of arms. These things were taken a lot more seriously in the past, and the elites still treated that seriously with crest magic, coat of arms. That's why I bring up the coat of arms and everything, because there's so much to the coat of arms that you have if you have one. It defines how you were treated historically. Rather, you take in the Tartaria conspiracies or otherwise of alt history and clone people, which I went into extensively, which is not necessarily a bad theory, as crazy as it sounds. And I've went into that before. We'll go into it again. I'm trying to stick with the main thought process going back to the psychic phenomenon. It just, for me, and you will learn as you watch me, I say a lot of things that appear to be tangents, but they all connect to the greater argument I'm making. So you've got the foundations of society that have been built on, let's just see how many times he's mentioned Rockefeller in this book. Fuck. I mean, look at how many times he mentions Rockefeller, and you hear about Rockefeller, but most of the mainstream, conspiracy alt tech shit wants to, focus on Rothschild and certain aspects of the Likud party. Never mention Joshua Kushner. Only focus on Jared, that fucking limited hangout nonsense. But the Rockefellers did so much damage to the human condition for their greed, their railroads, and the dynasties that they involved themselves with, like Bush, oil, and trading with the enemy during the Nazis, and the formations of what we would determine to be factually correct and how to function as people goes back to this cabal that is very easily understood, connects to Rothschild and other European, monarchy and nobility and aristocracy. And it goes into his thoughts on the Fourth Reich. Jim Barnes, like I said, you need to check out his books. You need to get physical copies, and if you ever have enough money, get these copies. It's very important that you read. Before we go right back into the psychic abilities, I want to stress my point further. Now, power and politics in the media. This is brilliant. This is one of many types of books. The Year in C-SPAN Archives Research by Robert X. Browning. I have not personally went through all of this, but I've been through so many similar books. We have no idea in the terminally online, consumerist, radically altered, dopamine fried society that we have become, and how influencers and content creators have become the mainstream media. And the legacy corporate media is becoming in a phase of owning intellectual properties and becoming the new fusion of streaming bundles and content creator handles on social media, powered by ad revenue and subscriptions. but they're still influencing and buying your favorite content creators. You'd be surprised how many have handlers just to navigate them through their own psyop. And psyops aren't necessarily bad. People, you need to understand how government functions if you're ever going to make a difference. If you want to make a difference in the system, which is possible, you need to go about it a radically different way and understanding how the system functions to work it in your favor. Understanding the history of the anti-federalists, knowing they had their own papers. When you were in school, you saw the federalist and the anti-federalist, but you only heard about the federalist papers. There's so much into this. The effect of media on the masses that came onto the internet age, which already had an ethos and built-in audience of non-normie based people. But when the youth stars became online icons on like YouTube and Facebook and early age MySpace, as it developed further into the social media age and getting people to make money on here, that's when everything changed. And now everything is on the internet and the culture is dual in nature. The people that built the internet age to make it what it is with the media that they present, like Newgrounds, Only Plays, the other comedians and politicians and you know content creators, early Alex Jones, No More News, Johnny Gat, Vigilante Intelligence, other people that have evolved over the years to become bedrocks of the political landscape. And all of and this can apply to even the UFO discussion, because how you are psyoped every day by the psyop that is the internet. It would amaze you and how much, like the Brain Institute under the Obama initiative or the Obama administration, the Brain Initiative, you know, you are taught that this is nonsense when it absolutely is real. People like Yuri Geller, the Israeli mutant, basically metahuman. We should call them metahumans. I have my own abilities that I practice and my own warlock sorcery based in esoteric Eastern and Western occult alike. I am a warlock practitioner of the modern day that sees it the way the elite sees it in the structure in which it is understood. How you need to treat magic, how you need to treat science, how you need to, at least in my own flavor that works for me. Because I don't believe that there's one particular way. I don't believe in objective morality, and I believe in nuance in everything. I believe morality to be arbitrary, but all of what I mentioned is just to give you context. The First Earth Battalion was an actual military unit that the men who stare at goats talked about. U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon. And there's, like I said, the men who stare at goats. The men who stare at goats. There it is. This is a mockumentary, but it is based on what really was being researched and conducted. And if you think that at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, I hate to admit it, the phasing out of reality, running towards the wall, you would be surprised at the very fundamental nature research, how that could be quantum plausible should you be able to do your chakra systems and your somatics and the electric output by your own body and the interacting with the ether. I do see the science of today finally going back to ether studies after the blight of Einstein and the fraudulent nature of the physics movement that developed out of Einstein, who was telling people, I don't want to debate you like the 101 scientists against Einstein or 100 scientists against Einstein. I can't remember it's basically one or the other of that. The scientists in Europe who wanted to debate Einstein, and they got called anti-Semite in the media, like the American scientists who wanted to debate Einstein. You were called anti-Semite in the media media if you basically went against what a guy who brought out eclipse sciences that were fundamentally the nature of what was presented was understood by records of 1500s eclipse science. And there's Christopher John Bjerknes is he's a wonderful example of that particular research. He's got family stake in that. But the we're going to get into this too. Uh, the men who stare at goats, the psychic phenomena of the men who literally were in the military using psychic abilities, stared down the goat with their methods and killed it. That actually was documented. Now, the skeptic movement, as I've been presenting, is built upon the axioms of Rockefeller doctrine. And I'm sure that detractors, from my opinion, will say, okay, you're using the anti-Verecundium, reductionist view to incorrectly. And I'm like, no, the foundations of what you believe are verifiably so by the engineering hands of Rockefeller's cabal. It's not just, Jim Marrs is not a nobody. He was a critically acclaimed, even by mainstream sources, as a good source. And he documents it and sources it in his own book. And we'll read some of all of this eventually. But, the power and politics in the media, to really understand how people are affected by the culture over time, and especially now in the internet age where everything is a Psy-Op, including the fucking ARPANET itself. You can talk about the Switzerland development of the public internet, but ARPANET, just knowing that the United States military had it as its own, meta project in the beginning. It's debatable how the internet truly became what it became. The Switzerland tech or the United States ARPANET fusions, and the pre-context of that. I'm not here to debate where the internet came from. I respect all of the channels of information trying to establish to me that the military industrial complexes of both, yes, the internet of Switzerland and the United States, there's clearly agendas and psyops taking place. And if you fail to understand just how much there is within the propaganda that goes into everyday things that you consume, it would concern you. That's all we live on now is reaction-based rage bait, clickbait, ad bait nonsense. Information age of hysteria. It's going out to idiot America. So this was a thing, a Jedi program by the fucking United States. And you should take that seriously. These people, Project Grill Flame, Operation Grill Flame, 1978 to 1982, was a classified U.S. Army and Defense Intelligence Agency DIA program that investigated the military applications of parapsychology. The project used remote viewing, the alleged psychic ability to perceive distant, unseen targets, for intelligence gathering, operating primarily out of Fort Meade, Maryland. So you see, they say purportedly. AI is terrible. People want this shit to go. AI would not be bad if it didn't have the sugar-coated context of Rockefeller-backed nonsense that has become intertwined with the woke and, politically correct diatribe that we have consumed over the last 100 years. In fact, going into this dialectic and how soft the GOP grand old party is, do you realize it was taken over and became the Trotskyite vehicle in the United States? You really need to study the history of the people who became your politicians. You'd be surprised. It's like the occultist Mathers who was claimed by his own inner circle and Aleister Crowley types to be the, have descendancy that is Marshall Bruce Mathers the third Eminem. This is not just who mind you, the whole reason I beef with Eminem in my meme magic, meme rap, gangster rap nonsense is because he was from Missouri, self-admitted, Alf shirt and cake comic book geek who went into the homosexual nature and demagoguery of the Jewish music industry, which is often a front for failed musicians to do live concerts for that basically act as surface running for intelligence and dope running for the mob to pay the bills of everything involved with being signed to a record label. This whole illusion of society that has been hoisted upon you and the heightening of your intellectual integrity and how you were robbed of true thought and intellectual capacity. This, you should realize that the people behind, the people behind this whole thing, like Ingo Swann, Pat Price, and, Uri Geller, these people have came on record and have admitted that anybody could basically do this. And there's this thing called 8 Martini theory that happened within the intelligence bureaus, that they would experience the truth of psychic abilities, bending spoons, machines, and psychic abilities, and telepathy, and and all that. And it would make them drink and go mad because it was true. Going into Pat Price, this man was so good that he had the ODNI, the Investigation Bureau of the United States, coming after him because they thought he was espionage, because people like him are getting so good in their research that when they remote view with their mind, they see a abandoned building that's not abandoned, but occupied by actual federal military and intelligence, buildings with inside the buildings having briefcases and cabinets with documents of the names of the actual operation and active officers that he just saw with his mind. Seeing things before they've happened, and then it's documented, meaning that remote viewing is omnidirectional and can be retrocausal in nature. Lending credence that this goes into the, Dr. Salvatore Dr. Salvatore Pais, right? This man is brilliant, and he's patenting with the United States Navy vouching for him, room temperature semiconductors, things that can interact with anti-gravity. Do you realize that this is real? And just because you're told by academia that has its systemically, historically been purchased and brought to you by Rockefeller Foundation Philanthropy, and the Chicago Institute that he was heavily involved with people like the Skull and Bones, which John Kerry and George W. Bush were a part of, the cartels in the Middle East, and oil tycoons that involved themselves with the radical elements of Abad Lubavitch and the Likud party, Benjamin Netanyahu types, to rapid foreign policy destruction of Gaza and the Middle East and cause instability for the Oded Yanan Greater Israel Project, that has its tentacles within the Trump administration and the Heritage Foundation-based policies of the Knights Templar aspects of the War Department right now. The fact that they've changed it back to historically the Department of War from the Department of Defense is not necessarily bad. I think that's a good thing, but learn the ethos and the mindscape and how these people see the world. Have context, ideation like I do with my Clifton strengths. Try to think on this level the best you can. I know most people don't think on my level. Not to be arrogant, I'm speaking in a context that involves a study with Clifton strengths that defined my palette of understanding, and they're all within the strategic thinking domain. That's rare, and I'm telling you, I'm an INTPA logician. from the Myers-Briggs. So I'm telling you from a place of, at least my context of understanding is tying all of what we've been talking about together and explaining to you why, how it is typically viewed, and even the produced and professed alternative views are engineered psyops that are incorrect. And you really need to start thinking about how life functions for real. Too many people are stuck on accidental political theory that everything's by negligence, bureaucracy, and minor corruption of that particular era. But some will profess that they don't accept 9/11's official story. Even the fucking administrations are more or less talking about it, throughout the years, especially the Trump administration. The the nature of Watergate, that was a real thing. JFK is a real thing. MLK, these conspiracies add up, and conspiracy in the legal textbook and definitions therein being to conspire as a cabal of sorts to accomplish something. And no, unlike David Icke or all these people who say that it's a homogenized and non-human intelligence, you don't understand how people function. People cabal, people gather, people conspire like that in a monolith, but then that goes away. If you robbed a bank, would you just be hanging out with the people that you robbed the bank with if you got away? That's how you got to see it. These people see it like a Grand Theft Auto heist. The entrepreneurs of the, breakaway civilizations, talking about Richard Dolan level, ufology, documented credible, instances of potential breakaway civilizations. And I went into that extensively as well. You need to start understanding how the black world sees the world before you could even have a remote chance of influencing how the politics are actually waged. Everyday people could make a difference, and voting is not going to help you. I'm one of those people who says, in current context, we even vote in the media, it's like if a tree falls, do you know if you don't hear it, if you're not around to hear it? Type shit. So if you don't know who's running, if you don't get told in the media, and the media slanders anybody who really becomes a threat over the years, Republican or Democrat. Trump is just the shoe-in fixture to, the steam valve to release pressure from the people for social engineering. And the internet basically made it to where if you have the internet and you're not starving, you're not rebelling, you're not making a difference, period, really. But bitching about it on the internet and causing minor meme magic, where the elites will dominate you by their advanced occult research. The elites have nothing but time on their hands to study, to go take a plane ride down to the South America to get ayahuasca daily if they wanted. You see, that's the level of occult that Donald Trump, Roy Cohn meme magic is on. And you don't know your enemy. You may know the basics of the Jewish question that was produced to you by people like Alexander Dugin and the alt-right funnels that channel this pro-Third Reich Russian and anti-Zionist narratives during a time when people are starting to learn about Jewish elements. When you don't specify the Likud party, the radicals of the Chabad-Lubavitch network, and the banking cartel syndicate of like Rothschild and the foundations of what we consider even to be remotely true and possible by the likes and financing of philanthropy of people like Rockefeller, and how eventual generations will be influenced by Bill Gates and his philanthropy. Not just to shred the doom, how Gabe Newell of Steam might be philanthropy. You see, this is all, you underestimate philanthropy and its effects on your mind. You believe what you believe to be possible solely because of people like Rockefeller. Because they're the ones who put the textbooks in your school and paid the teachers' unions with financing, not even in just a corrupt sense, but financing. Philanthropy defined who you are today and why you still are skeptical on superpowers and aliens. I just want you to understand that there is documented proof of this. They admitted it out of their own mouths, out of arrogance. And you know what? They were right, because I'm one of the very few people who speaks on such a nuanced level. And if you want to study more into the psychic spies phenomena, I've shown Annie Jacobson's phenomena. You got things like, you know, if you like the Jim Mars brand of conspiracy research, he's here as well. Look at that. So much is in this book. I'm just, fast rewinding. But this was him interviewing. Jim Mars interviewed the people from the United States that spoke about this. It's a phenomenal read as well. His other books, Ruled by Secrecy, talking about the Trilateral Commission. These, they still have power today. They're not meme worthy anymore. You've had evolutions of the Trilateral Commission, the types that evolved from it. And, you had the Bilderbergers in the 2000s and the 20 summits, the summits, the G20s. So you had understandings from that, you know, but it evolves. Now in modern day, it's the World Economic Forum and Davos. You're not seeing them all correctly. They sometimes conspire together, but they do not absolutely work in a monolith. That's how the Jews work. If you're a Jew, you become easier to work with, but there's several types of Judaism. And then they even hate themselves among themselves when it comes to intellectual debates on what is proper and how to conduct your daily life, from rabbinical, ultra-Orthodox to Messianic to, Torah-based, Tanakh-based, Samaritan, Tanakh-based, Second Temple Judaism, historical, Judea, Israel, having your understandings of Christianity and Islam and further on, which I still consider just Judaism. So you have to understand how complex this narrative is, but understand where these people cabal together, where they conspire together, and when they dislocate to keep themselves preserved and out of any legal or, mob rule mentality consequences or repercussions. But this man has developed ways of propulsion and energy generation, superconductors that can operate on regular temperature. They usually are sub-zero cold space like shit. And this guy has patented methods and verified and vouched for by the United States Navy and Space Force. Salvatore Cesar Pais is a Romanian-American near aerospace engineer and inventor, currently works for the United States Space Force, having previously been employed at the Naval Air Warfare Center aircraft, goes into his story on Wikipedia. This man is developing crazy tech. They're developing the TR3B type shit's evolution right now. We need to talk about like how Richard Dolan has documented the early 50s anti-gravity craze and the breakaway civilization notions. I've talked about it, several times on my own thing. So it needs to be understood that there is so much that has went into producing for you a manufactured and, quite frankly, horseshit ideology and what you even perceive to be real. And you got to make sure that you're not appealing to the authority fallacy and, going back to, how they want you to see the world through academic lenses that the Wright brothers flew despite academia at the time professing that, and this includes the military's intelligence, the heavier than air flight was impossible, but yet they flew. The Wright brothers flew. The Wright brothers flew. So you should really consider how you've been lied to over the years and just what actually is true. Look, Project Sunstreak. You know, Project Sunstreak was a secret 1980s U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency DIA program established to investigate and utilize psychoenergetics, commonly known as remote viewing, for intelligence gathering. The remote viewing and what can possibly be done with such things such as the double slit experiment, the observer theory. Why it collapses from a wave function possibility into a quantum particle certainty, the wavelength into the particles. So what you observe actually absolutely matters, and how your hardware interprets it, how your brain synapses, neural pathways, neurotransmitters, and how your neurons fire when you are understanding. And basically how you even interpret reality is determined by how finely tuned it actually is for you, and how your brain fires. So, and I hate, and I'm trying to not make this so complicated. And you know, it's a whole dynamic that if you don't even begin to scrape the understandings, you will not have a proper understanding. This this very nature of the double slit experiment, not to mention the eraser cannon experiment. Double split quantum eraser, or yeah, double slit quantum eraser. This shit right here, you are told that even despite the retrocausality that is being developed, you know, they don't want you to look at it like it's time travel observation. When you also look at the findings, the sheer findings from shit like Project Stargate, bro. The overall branch of investigations during the 70s and psychic phenomena. And I've only mentioned a handful. There are several others. And the CIA vault has so many declassified lookings into their research into the afterlife, into quantum mad science. The Kretzios retreat memo, where he says, you know, let's see, Kretzios retreat memo. This was the White House talking about, time travel. He did say time travel. If you really study what they are developing right now, and self-admitted, the patent offices were vouched, for Salvatore Pais's tech by the U.S. Navy, and I'm sure right now the Space Force. This shit is real. And he's talking about leaving time and space annihilated with new technologies. And this goes into the UFO question of this whole idea of a 79, 80-year plus gatekeeping operation by intelligence operatives to suppress a breakaway civilization, which absolutely is happening. And if you don't believe that, it's going to become a matter of authority has to tell you otherwise. And that is severely unfortunate, but it makes sense, because if you look at our ancient texts and people like Robert Morningsky, who have discussed over the years native, which native is just boils down to Asians. Okay, I want to get rid of this linguistics of the Native American, when we're even told that they come from Asian territories in school. Not even having to get into Tartaria. But, You really need to understand the level that the United States military and obviously other world governments like Russia, Israel with the Talpiot program, Cyber Intelligence Unit 8200 and Shin Bet having all of the cyber tech in Israel headquartered with their backdoors into Intel processing chips and so forth, backdoors for blackmail. If you're not understanding the level that Palantir is getting its information fed, and just mundane people like me who read a few books and study the right documentaries at the right time while the algorithm fed it to me, namely the time period between 2014 to 2017 ish. It was still all right, I would say, but it got real bad. But I went to others like BitChute and Rumble and found Johnny Gat still. You can still find Johnny Gat and all of wonderful information, which boils me into the next idea of race realism. This guy right here, Exophonate, did a brilliant job explaining why you should understand and, why you should accept that the mainstream understandings of race being about a skin or hair follicle or something is outright ludicrous and goes against evolutionary track. That the Negroid going back to Australopithecus, the theories of hybridization with Seraphim of the Asians, Seraphim, reptile and plural I am, so reptilians, the legends of the Mesopotamian lore of the Oanese, of the other Zora, Zelda type fish type people, the aquatic, amphibious, and reptilian nature of some of the non-human intelligence, like those such as Davis, have come out and actually professed on a record to be Eric Davis talking about what he perceived to be four alien races, which I think when it comes to the races of aliens, the grays are basically little green reptoid biohybrids in the way of Day After Roswell. And Corso was speaking about. I take Corso's testimony seriously. I do find the bedrock of let's see, where's it at? I have it in here. The Day After Roswell. I do take what he said in this seriously, Philip Corso and William J. Burns. This book should be brought up. We should be bringing up books of the age when we question the government and the recent reviews of like Pursue, and AARO. They matter so much, these pieces of literature. People like this not getting many views. I mean, it's a lot of views, but realistically, it's almost got 1 million. And you should check this video out. Talking about the differences and why the classifications and apologetics as to why you should trust, why you should not trust modern academia and their cultural understandings. I mean, going back into the mental cleanliness movement and the mental hygiene and how they perceived what was mentally unfit and what was mentally fit per what Rockefeller's goons wanted people to believe for a better society of workers. And this is my research uh, playlist. You can find it on my YouTube channel here. I'll link you if you ever want to see it. This has so much research into it. You can see on the side. Just we had Elon Musk talking about this, and I've had this research collecting going on for years. There's over 500 videos. Going into the Yale courses on the Old and New Testament. The GATE program. People, alternative thinkers. Dan McClellan. His books are wonderful. I don't actually agree with him in the sense of how he perceives it, but then again, he's not of that religion. He's admitted he's of a different persuasion. I see it as the ancient aliens Mauro Bellino style, a cargo culted ancient aliens, and I do believe that, and it is fitting with the modern UFO narratives, going into legal information. So there's so much you could look at there, going into Zionist propagandas and this and that. So you really have been psyoped so much that you quite frankly really can't tell what reality is, and they persuade you not to really focus on old literature. This old literature is priceless, and you have it at your fingertips. And I get it, reading a book sucks, but sometimes you got to do it. And if you're not really understanding the narratives in these books, and these aren't nobodies, there's credible evidence in all of this, for various, aspects. If you're not understanding the level in which the psyop is taking place, you will truly be lost, and you will not be able to formulate a true fight against the power structure that bees in any meaningful way. Doesn't even imply that it would have to be violent. Understanding the not the 1871 Organic Act and the District of Columbia Organic Act, making the city-state structure and restructuring the formula structure of the United States government protocols. That when, the legal language of the 17th, 80s Constitution, and philosophical thinkers like, Lysander Spooner's No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, understanding legal theory and judicial notice of commercial venue, understanding that how law works and how it's set up is basically a bunch of, a judge is a debt collector loan shark enforced by robber baron thugs, to understand and even navigate into a collective understanding and cooperation and social cohesion of government, and how to manipulate and maneuver your way in today's age without being psyoped to death. It's just something that you should consider. So it's quite funny, actually. That's about all. Peace out.